true ground you will find down there will be each other.
Yeah, have faith in your brothers. Yeah. Everyone except him. I sense heresy from this one. He's corrupted. You can see it on his skin. I honestly can't believe it. 3 good games came out back to back in the last few weeks. First Black Myth Wukong, then Astro Bot, now this. Maybe the video game industry is finally starting to turn around. So I should probably just get out of the way first that I'm not the biggest fan of Warhammer 40k. I like the aesthetics, I like the themes. You guys already know I like any edgy, dark stuff. And all of the gore and senseless violence definitely appeals to my inner 12-year-old. That said, I am nowhere near an expert on the lore. Not that it really matters for this game, because there's really not that much story, but I just thought you should know that going in. I'm mostly just going to analyze this as a video game first and foremost, and I think this game does a pretty good job at achieving the niche it's trying to fill. Mainly as a sequel to the first game, which was a cult classic from the PS3 360 era, and also just in general as a horde shooter hack and slash hybrid game. I think it nails both of those aspects fairly well. Certainly not a flawless game. It definitely has a lot of the same flaws that other games in this genre do, but I think if you can manage to convince 2 of your buddies to play this with you, you can have a damn good time. Now, another thing I want to make clear is that I really don't have a hell of a lot of things to say about this game. I think what you see is what you get, and the actual gameplay loop is pretty simplistic, so this is actually a review of 2 games. If you'd like to hear my thoughts on Astro Bot, feel free to use the chapter feature to skip to that section of the video. But the short version is, if you like 3D platformers, and I love them, I grew up with them, so I really have a soft spot for the genre, this is a surprisingly good one, probably because it was made by Sony's only Japanese studio left. It feels like both a love letter to PlayStation and to Mario, strangely enough, and I actually really enjoyed my time with that game as well. And also, one last thing, since this is a positive game review, that means not as much my usual audience is going to click on this video, let's be honest, so I would appreciate if you did all of the generic YouTube engagement crap, aka liking, commenting, subscribe if you haven't, and hit the notification bell. Not that YouTube is going to notify you of my videos or streams anyway, but I'm sure every bit helps. So without further ado, here is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. So if you've already played the first game, I honestly don't have to elaborate too much on the basic gameplay loop. I heavily procrastinated playing the first, but thankfully I did pretend to be a professional for once and took the time to play the first one, and they are very similar, so I can say with confidence that if you like the first game, you're probably going to like the second, though I bet you've already played the game by the time you see this video. Okay, as for everyone else, I might as well break down the basic gameplay. Now, it's kind of hard to describe this game. I'm just going to settle on saying it's a hybrid between Gears of War and Dynasty Warriors. You fight hordes of weaker enemies that you can easily carve to pieces with your chain sword, and you can switch to third-person shooting at basically any time. Unlike Gears of War, there's very little cover-based shooting in this game, which is definitely a good thing. I hate cover-based shooting, and the melee combat might be even more simplistic than Dynasty Warriors, which is really saying something. I guess we'll start with the melee combat first. You've got light attacks, you can hold down the button to do a heavy attack, and that's pretty much the entire extent of your combos. You also have a dodge roll, which is kind of comical to see this huge beefy-ass Space Marine do a Dark Souls dodge roll, which of course has invincibility frames. And perhaps even more importantly, you have a parry which can deflect most attacks except for ones that are flashing red. And specifically, enemy attacks that flash blue when you parry them allow you to get a counterattack in with your pistol. The melee combat, although pretty simplistic, is also highly satisfying since you can kill most of the basic enemies in one hit. And specifically, your stomp move on the chain sword is incredibly satisfying and is almost identical to the first games. Now, to avoid being extremely repetitive, there are 4 different types of melee weapons. I barely use the combat knife, so I can't really comment on it, but I will say the power sword and the hammer feel incredibly satisfying to use, and the power sword felt just a little bit overtuned, especially considering it doesn't even have heavy attack combos. It switches between 2 different attack stances, but it does so much stagger damage while also swinging quickly that the special units often didn't even have a chance to attack me, so I could just spam the R1 button until I could execute them. And speaking of executions, much like the classic God of War games, there are cool, gory executions that you can perform on a bunch of different enemies. Now, the main difference between the first game and the second is that in the first Space Marine, performing an execution restored about half of your health, whereas your armor functioned more like Halo's shielding, where after a few seconds of not getting hit, it would regenerate back. This helped the first game maintain a relatively fast pace because rarely were you required to take cover. All you had to do is hit a basic orc enemy type with a strong attack and it opened them up for execution. Now in the sequel, the health system is completely changed. Performing executions now gives you armor back instead of health, and so now your main way of maintaining health is through the new Bloodborne style rally system where you can hit enemies to regain recently lost health. The only way to get your maximum health back is either by using a healing item that you find out in the field, or by using Titus's special combat ability where he goes into a rage mode and hits enemies to get health back. Now, because this is a 3-player co-op game, it's actually balanced around this mechanic, so you're not really going to miss the old style of getting all your health back. This game would be a complete breeze if you could. And I honestly think it's a really good change just because it makes you actually fear the special units. A strong Tyrannid can tear you to shreds if you don't time those parries and just button mash, especially if you're up against 2 of them at the same time. Now, as for the shooting, I have a bit less to say on this. It really just feels like, again, a PS3 era third-person shooter. You guys have probably played a shit ton of these if you're watching me. So if you miss that era of gaming, you'll probably be just fine with this. I do want to note here that I played this game on Veteran, which honestly wasn't that difficult, at least when I played it with 2 other real people. The bots in this game are ass, so I won't be surprised if people playing this by themselves on hard will probably struggle. I think the game might be just a little bit too easy on Veteran, and we'll get into why, because it's directly related to the shooting. So because Space Marines are absolute units, as you would expect, their guns are just as massive. But for some reason, pretty much every variant of a bolter in this game just doesn't do the damage it should. In the first game, I think I did just about as much shooting as melee combat, whereas in the sequel, I felt much more incentivized to do melee, partially because of how the health system works, but also because shooting just wasn't that strong for roughly the first half of the game. But of course, as they drip feed more and more new weapon types, you slowly start to realize what the good guns are, and then it almost becomes the opposite, where guns are actually too powerful. I'd say the Meltas, which are basically shotguns, and 2 or 3 of the snipers are definitely too strong. Now, this isn't so much an issue for the Meltas, because this is meant to be a close-range combat game. It perfectly fits Warhammer to shotgun blast a dude, carve him up with your power sword, and then execute him, right? That definitely feels like the intended gameplay loop. What doesn't is sitting back 100 yards and just sniping everybody from behind cover. There's no cover mechanic in this game, so the game really isn't designed around you just standing behind a pillar and headshotting everyone. That's what I ended up doing for the last quarter of the game, and it was incredibly effective, comically so. And maybe more important than it being overpowered is that it's really just not that engaging. You would think that the snipers and shotguns would have some kind of special ammo that you can't refill, but no, you can refill them just like any other bolter. The only limitation on ammo is for the heavy weapons, which take both of your hands to hold. You can't refill those, and you lose access to your melee weapon, instead replacing it with a gun bash that is way weaker. And I really don't think the heavy bolter is strong enough to justify losing access to one of your most powerful tools. Especially if you get swarmed, then you have no effective way of getting your health back. And I think this is too much of a nitpick to really be worth complaining about, but I think the plasma pistol is just objectively the best handgun. It's charge shot, although it consumes a shit ton of ammo, just does way more damage than the other options. So while I wouldn't say the shooting feels bad by any stretch, I think the guns that are good feel good. It's just some of them need to be buffed, namely the bolters. And I think the snipers need to be adjusted somehow. I generally don't approve of nerfing guns in PvE games, but maybe they should at least nerf how the ammo works and make them a special weapon type that you can't refill at any box. Because it really was boring using just the las sniper and the plasma pistol for like the last 2 hours of the game because there really weren't any better options. Now, to get to another thing I really liked about the gameplay, there's a couple levels in this game where you get access to a jetpack, much like the first game. And the jetpack just feels really good to use because for most of the game, you're stuck to the ground. There's no jump button. And it's a personal pet peeve of mine when a game doesn't let you jump, so when you finally get the jetpack and you get some real player freedom, it feels amazing. And being able to hover in the air and shoot, and air dash, and do a super strong charge melee attack into a group of enemies, all of that feels awesome. The only trade-off it has is locking away your character's special ability, which does hurt a little bit since Titus's ability is so strong, but it's a good trade-off for sure. Now, on to the enemy variety. I'd say they did just fine here. It's not amazing, but it's just good enough, especially given that the campaign is only like 7 to 8 hours long. As for the whole orcs versus Tyranids debate for the main enemy type of these games, I definitely prefer the orcs conceptually and aesthetically. I like that they're based off of football hooligans, basically a bunch of violent idiots who just want to fight. And the fact that all their machines are basically just cobbled together scrap metal that shouldn't work, but just does, is a really good concept. Whereas Tyranids are just the same alien bug species that wants to devour everything that I'm sure you've seen in a bunch of other sci-fi media by now. But if we're talking about gameplay, I just think the Tyranids are more fun to actually shoot at and fight. The problem with the orcs in Space Marine 1 is that the game was way too afraid to show you new enemy types quickly. Given that you're fighting for about 95% of that game, you're going to end up fighting the same 5 orc enemy types over and over and over again. I pretty much got tired of fighting them about 2 hours in. Whereas I didn't start to feel repetition fighting this game's enemy types until the operations mode. I won't break down every enemy type, but to get into the specials, I think the standard warrior units felt just deadly enough that if you weren't paying attention, you could easily lose half or more of your health, which was a really smart decision for the first major enemy type of the game, because it teaches you early on when the big boys show up, you can't just mash melee and hope for the best. I think the burrowing snake enemy type was definitely the most annoying, as they could just pop out of the ground, grab your character, and then you lose over half your health in a matter of seconds. But it did encourage teamwork because your buddies could knock them off of you with enough damage or stagger. The Neurothorps were also a fairly annoying enemy type, these floating head dudes that shoot psychic blasts at you from afar. Though once you knew to focus them down early, they weren't too much of a problem. But just like the warrior enemy types, they're powerful enough to immediately demand your attention and focus them down, once again promoting teamwork. My least favorite enemy type was easily the little fungal spores that explode. These things on Veteran do way too much fucking damage. I can't imagine how annoying they are on the hardest difficulty. If you let them get close to you, there's a good chance you're just fucking dead. There's also a couple boss enemy types, a stalker, and just a huge hulking tank of a beast. And those were both decent fights as well, though they are recycled later in the game. Now, if for some reason you're concerned about spoilers, I'll spoil the other enemy faction. It's Chaos. You gotta fight Chaos Marines and some Tzeentch demons. And some Chaos Corrupted Guardsmen, though they're hardly enemy types. You can literally sprint into them and splatter them into blood mist. That looked like you just walked into them. And it's when you fight Chaos that the game turns into more of a typical third-person shooter. Melee becomes incredibly risky because the Chaos Marines can do a crazy amount of damage in a short amount of time. Their Chaos bullets that they fire, they're like homing rounds, can easily kill you in a matter of seconds. And so that's when the gameplay loop started becoming more boring. The true threats are a couple of the late game Chaos Marine types. There's one with a flamethrower that can do a crap ton of burst damage. And even worse are the Terminator armor ones, which can absorb an insane amount of punishment and shoot a bunch of homing missiles over and over and over again. I absolutely despise that enemy type. There's one point in the game where they send like 3 of them at the same time, and that was just annoying as hell. As for the boss unit, they have Chaos Corrupted Dreadnoughts, which look really cool, and that was a fun fight. So I'd say the enemy variety was solid, at least for the campaign experience. Now it's time to talk about the level design, albeit briefly, because there's really not much to say. This is a dressed-up, piss-filter, corridor third-person shooter from the 360 era, 1-to-1. Thankfully, without the piss filter, actually the colors in this game are fairly vibrant at times. The aesthetic is just really great for Warhammer 40k, and it seems pretty faithfully recreated here, though, like I said, I'm not really a super fan. Maybe the nerds could point out how some shit breaks the lore or whatever. But the game is pretty to look at, for sure. But the level design is just incredibly bland. It's just all hallways with an excessive amount of invisible walls, and since there's no way to jump, that really limits your movement options. Where most of the variety in gameplay comes from are defending objectives or a certain gimmick for that section of the level, whether it be the jetpack or it be a swarm of rats you need to keep back with a flamethrower, things like that. The objective missions are kind of interesting because this game uses the same engine as World War Z. If you played that game, the main appeal was it could have hundreds of zombies on screen climbing into piles, and you would have to defend an area and blow up the piles of zombies with grenades. And Space Marine 2 has those sections pretty much 1-to-1. The Tyranids will stack on each other just like the fast zombies. And I think seeing hundreds of enemies on screen is still fairly impressive, even if we've seen it a few times by now. But yeah, I think that more or less covers it. I would have liked some kind of gameplay freedom, even if it was just more branching paths, or maybe you could do certain objectives out of order. Any kind of freedom that wasn't walking in a straight line would have been nice. But given that this game is designed around having a 3-player co-op campaign, maybe it's for the best that you can only go one direction. Now, normally there would be a story section here, but I don't really have much to say about the story. The story reminds me a lot of the Halo games, or pretty much any like 80s sci-fi action movie. And maybe that'll disappoint some people if you're into the more deep Warhammer lore, or you like the books or something. But for me, I was completely fine with essentially what felt like a Halo game story, but with a lot more grimdark and very little humor. I think the appeal of Warhammer 40k is pretty obvious. It's almost satire level ultra masculinity. It's all about a never-ending war in a dystopian far future where you and your uber-mentioned bros team up to wipe out the endless demonic and alien hordes. And it's just a fun time. It doesn't really have to be that complex. The only part of the story I really didn't like is that there's a lot of interpersonal drama between you and your 2 squad mates. And it really just comes down to Titus not trusting his teammates, which obviously causes conflict. And that's really annoying to see on screen when you know exactly where it's going, it plays out exactly how you think, and it's not really done particularly well either. And I also think thematically the story would have been a lot more interesting if they had leaned harder into the Imperium's fascistic/theocratic devotion to the Emperor. At least story-wise, there's a lot of background dialogue that shows that off, but I don't know, I'm so used to the Flash Gets cartoons where the characters seem so over the top that this felt a lot more subdued in comparison. There's also quite a few twists in the story, some of which good, some of which I didn't really care about personally. But I really think it serves its purpose as a video game story to be just enough motivation to keep playing. I'm the type of guy who barely needs a story to justify playing through a game. I think as long as your character has a very basic motivation, even if it's as simple as save the princess from the dragon, that works for me. And this game's story isn't too many levels above that. And one more thing I gotta briefly mention is the small amount of wokeness in the game, depending on your definition. Basically, the only left-wing propaganda I noticed while playing this game is the comical amount of diversity. The most offensive being the major of the Cadian guardsmen, who is an Indian woman, an ugly one at that. Remember, Testosterone converts to estrogen. Speaking of estrogen. Yeah, that's something, alright. Can we shoot her? Just stomp on her on accident. If you compare her to the woman from the first game, it's like night and day. And while she really doesn't do much during the story other than yell on the comms throughout the first half of the game, it's just incredibly annoying seeing girl boss characters in this day and age, especially in a supposedly grim dark universe. And the diversity isn't just the guardsmen, it's also the space marines. Now, again, I'm not an expert on the lore, but I understand that space marines come from gene seed, which comes from their primarchs, right? Which comes from ultimately the emperor. So why are all these ultramarines different ethnicities? Shouldn't they all be the same race as Gilliman? Again, I'm not an expert on this, but I feel like portrayals I've seen of Space Marines, they're generally all white, except for the salamanders, who are like charcoal black or something. One of Titus's squad mates is black-ish, and the other one is like a Happa or something. It's hard to tell because they all have these weird Giga Chad features. Basically, every Space Marine looks like the Chad meme, so there is one Space Marine that is just straight up undeniably African, which is bizarre. He's corrupted. You can see it on his skin. Either way, you get the point. This has definitely got to be a retcon for diversity purposes. And yeah, I gotta say, it definitely distracted me. It wasn't woke enough for me to say like, oh, this is blatant propaganda, but it's clear to see that Games Workshop is going down a slippery slope. I mean, there's a female custodes, aka the Super Space Marines that guard the Emperor. And if they're willing to make a female Super Space Marine, you better fucking believe they're gonna have a female regular Space Marine in the next couple years. So certainly something to look out for in the future. For those of you who are concerned about dropping $70 on a 7 to 8 hour campaign that you might just play once and never again, of course there are also two multiplayer modes. There's Operations, which is more or less exactly what you think it is. It's basically like Spec Ops and Call of Duty or any similar optional side campaign, with the addition of armor customization, a progression system involving both a perk tree and upgradable weapons, and of course there's a bunch of character classes you can choose from that each have a unique ability that fills a specific role on a team. I played as Vanguard, which gets a grappling hook, which plays a lot like Vanguard from Mass Effect. You use the grapple to pull yourself to enemies and then either slice the shit out of them with your chain sword or shotgun them in the face with the Melta. The main problem I see with Operations is that this is supposed to be the grindy end game, but the combat was already starting to feel a little repetitive by the end of campaign, so I can't imagine fighting the same two enemy factions over and over and over again to grind loot or experience points or currency or whatever is going to be fun for very long. Like I've said multiple times in this review already, if you have two buddies, you could pretty much have fun playing almost anything, but if you really wanted a long-term game to play with friends, there's definitely better options out there. I'm not going to recommend Helldivers 2 since, no, I never touched it and I don't intend to, but I did play Deep Rock Galactic for a while, and that game has a lot more content and a lot more randomness that keeps it feeling fresh. Playing the same level on higher difficulty settings can only change so much, and honestly, just giving enemies more health, making them do more damage, and sending more of them at you just doesn't cut it anymore. That's the bare minimum. I'm not going to say they should do procedural generation, because one of this game's strengths is that the environments are so detailed, especially the skyboxes. It actually reminds me of Vanquish, which is one of Platinum Games' best games. You should absolutely play it if you haven't. But I just can't see this game being super engaging in the long term unless they're really going to crank up the production on the games as a service aspect and add more enemies, a new faction, more weapon types, etc., etc. And I wish I had more to say about Operations, but I honestly was getting tired of the game already, so I don't know. If you really like this game's gameplay, maybe you'll end up spending dozens of hours replaying the same missions over and over again, but I can't see myself doing that, honestly. And of course, there's one more mode. There's a PvP mode, which, sorry, I didn't even try, because I honestly don't really care about competitive multiplayer in games. I've heard this one is quite a bit more casual than most shooters are these days, which is definitely a good thing, but honestly, I just don't really care about PvP modes unless it's a game I really like, and that hasn't come around in a long time. The last shooter that I took even slightly seriously was Rainbow Six Siege, and that was like 4 years ago now. So I can't really confirm or deny if it's any good, but it's another mode just to show you that this game does have some content for the long term if you're worried that you're spending $70 on an 8-hour campaign, right? The amount of content is not the problem with this game, it's the diversity of content. Although I said in the story section that the enemy variety was just fine, by the time you're done with operations mode, you're going to desperately want some new enemy types. But I'd say that's really my only major problem with this game. And so, in conclusion, should you buy Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2? I would say get it on sale unless, of course, you're a super fan of Warhammer and you plan to play this with 2 friends. Then I guess you could probably justify buying this at full price. I mean, even though the campaign's only 7 to 8 hours, the operations mode will probably provide at least another 5 hours of entertainment, perhaps much more if you want to beat it on all of the various difficulties and grind out your character to max. And of course, there's also a PvP, which I didn't touch because I don't really care about PvP in a game like this. I think this game is just simple fun, and there's nothing wrong with that. In some ways, it feels like a time capsule back to 12 or 13 years ago when every game was sort of like this. But the upside being that this has much better graphics than PS3 era games. Honestly, if you had asked teenage me what games would look like in the future, Space Marine 2 is pretty close to that. In an era where almost every AAA game is either incredibly mediocre or full of propaganda or just flat out a buggy piece of shit, at least we have a pretty good game right here. So I think I can safely recommend this game despite the small amount of wokeness with the very weird out-of-place diversity. Now onto the Astro Bot review. Now again, just like I said in the intro, I do have quite a bit of bias towards 3D platformers, growing up with a bunch of them. Spyro, Crash 2, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal, Banjo-Kazooie, Super Mario Sunshine, these are all some of my favorite games of all time. And so finally, after 7 years of no high-budget 3D platformers, and that last one not being that good anyway, I really don't like Super Mario Odyssey for various reasons that I won't go into here. The last Japanese Sony studio finally has to step up and create the next great 3D platformer, and they actually succeeded. It's crazy. Now, I know the vast majority of my audience doesn't really care for this genre. Most of you are edgelords like myself. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time breaking down the gameplay, especially since this video turned out to be a little bit longer than I thought it would be anyway. I guess the important question is, what kind of 3D platformer is this game? Because, believe it or not, there are not all collectathons where you explore around these mini sandboxes and pick up all the shiny objects. No, Astro Bot is a lot more similar to a Mario game, or to a lesser extent Crash Bandicoot, where you go through a series of mostly linear levels containing a bunch of mini secret areas where you can find the various lost bots, puzzle pieces, and even some secret levels. You could basically think of it as somewhere between Super Mario 3D World and Super Mario Galaxy. In fact, this has a lot of similarities to Galaxy. It's only missing the ability to walk around many planets. Other than that, it's incredibly similar. Astro's basic moveset is actually incredibly simple, which might be one of my few real flaws with the game, that the movement and the jumping aren't really that fun, especially if you compare it to like Super Mario 64 or Sunshine's basic moveset. Astro's is very simple, and you don't unlock new abilities like Banjo-Kazooie, so the power-ups and the variety of level themes is what carries this game, definitely, without a doubt. And this game has a certain je ne sais quoi, or as we would say in certain forums, it has soul. You can tell a lot of effort went into the little details in this game. Again, like an old-style Nintendo game, this really just has a lot of charm. It's a very cute game. And of course, you can't talk about this game without talking about the numerous references to old PlayStation franchises, and a lot that aren't actually PlayStations, but were exclusives at the time, whether it be Castlevania, Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil, etc., etc. There's all kinds of little references to older PlayStation titles. And while you could say the member berries are pretty shallow, and in a way they actually made me sad because they remind me how much gameplay variety PlayStation exclusives used to have and how they actually cared about gameplay instead of making these condescending movie games with such morality lessons as be better and let minorities replace you. You'll actually be blown away how many great games in all sorts of different genres used to be PlayStation exclusives. But they're not just shallow references, there's also a bonus level at the end of each world that is themed after a major PlayStation franchise like Ape Escape or God of War or Uncharted. And I really enjoyed those as well. They each have a special level gimmick that you won't see in the normal levels that is themed around the character, and I thought that was just a really good idea. Again, to not go into too much unnecessary detail, I think this game is just simple fun. It's not super challenging, but it's not completely brain dead either. You die in one hit to basically anything, and there are some decent platforming challenges, at least more challenging than most modern Mario games get until the end game, right? It's not a hard game by any stretch, but if you're not paying attention, you can easily get killed. Not that there's really any consequences for dying anyway. But it's just enough to keep you invested, and that's really what I thought throughout this game. It does a very good job of keeping player retention because of all the level variety and just adding that teensy bit of challenge so that it doesn't feel completely brain dead. And like I've said twice already, I have a heavy bias for 3D platformers, so this might unironically be my game of the year. If not this, it's the indie game Yellow Taxi Goes Vroom that's also a 3D platformer. So I'm sure that will annoy some people when I get to best to worst games of 2024, but yeah, I honestly just think this is a great game. It's definitely not as good as Super Mario Galaxy, but that's also one of the greatest games ever made. But yeah, I'd say if you actually own a PS5, you should absolutely try this game. It is the best PS5 exclusive, which is incredibly sad, but I truly believe it. That's about it. I'll see you next time, guys.